Welcome, Anne. Thank you again for coming to talk to Hopi. For those who don't know Anne McShane, she's a lawyer, but she's also chair of Hopi in Ireland and Hands Off People of Iran in Ireland. And this recording is the second of a three-part series. We started talking about the Zhenotdel, the women's movement in 1917, before 1917. We talked about the revolutionary period, pre-revolutionary period. Today, we want to talk about 1917 to 1919. You correct me if I'm mistaken. I think these are important issues to talk about, given the recent struggles of Iranian women as part of a larger revolutionary movement, but very much in the forefront of that movement. Why is it important? Partly because given so many sacrifices, given so many imprisonments, injuries, deaths during the protests, we really ought to go beyond the simple individualistic demands of freedom from hijab or or the right to choose your own clothes or limited bourgeois style equality for women. And in this respect, the whole issue of women's position in the family, women's housework, women's responsibilities towards the family, the extended family, become very important. And in this respect, there aren't any middle-of-the-road answers. So traditionally, the left was telling us, you wait until the socialist revolution, everything will be solved after that. And we know from experience that isn't the case. And in many ways, unless these issues are discussed pre-revolution, they will go nowhere. So Anne has already started talking about the pre-revolutionary period for Zhenotdel. You can explain more about it once again, just as an introduction, but she's now going to talk about 1917 onwards. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Yasmin, and thank you for having me back again to speak on this subject. So today I want to speak about from 1919 until 1930, from the creation of the Zhenotdel to its demise. And last time we spoke, I talked about the manner in which the organization came together and its influences from within the Socialist Second International, from the revolutionary section of that. And I spoke about the important role of Clara Zetkin, the German revolutionary. And I think I may have mentioned, but I would say again, one of the things that's important about this movement is that, firstly, it didn't see the women's question as something separate to socialism. It didn't see its members didn't describe themselves as feminists of any kind, and they believed that feminism was ultimately a bourgeois movement, even if working class women were involved in it. And it wasn't, often has been described as that they were just against the upper class or upper middle class bourgeois feminists. But that's not actually correct. What they were against was the concept of being able to resolve women's questions within contemporary society, within capitalism. They were against the idea of seeking equality within today's society as an end in itself, and believed that it had to be connected at the very core of the struggle for socialism. So it was like within the struggle for socialism lay the struggle for liberation of all of humanity, as the economics change. So it shifts from a society based on private property to a society based on need. And with that, the socialization of domestic labor and childcare, and the integration of women into all aspects of society, with society taking responsibility for questions that were previously left to the domestic sphere. So anyway, so the Zhenotdel was formally launched in September 1919. I've said a little bit previously about the year before its creation, but there had been a Congress in late 1918, which led to women's commissions being set up. The leadership of the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party Bolshevik at the time, decided to make this a part of the party itself, a department answerable to the Central Committee. And so this was launched. And it had as its first leader Inessa Armand, who was an important Bolshevik and had played a leading role before the revolution, very close to Lenin and Krupskaya, and very instrumental in the fight against the pro-war elements in the period before 1917. Anyway, so she was the first leader. And what she did in her short time as leader, because unfortunately she died the following September 1920 from cholera. What she did, however, was extremely important in putting forward a kind of a modus operandi, a way of organizing that was to mark out the Zhenotdel for its entire life. So what she did was that she set up what were called delegate meetings, and delegate meetings were organizations which were based either in the workplace or in local districts, and they were organized groups of working class women. And what they did was they elected delegates and they took decisions about what type of work they wanted to do. For instance, setting up nurseries, setting up public canteens, factory inspections, because one of the things that was very important was making sure that women's working environment was safe, that the laws that had been passed in 1917, making women equal, actually meant something in reality. And also what these delegate meetings did was they voted or selected certain women to go and train either in a workplace or go to university or another technical college, and then come back and train others who were in the factory who hadn't had recourse to that education. And to continue that process, another person will go forward. So for instance, there was a university set up called Zhenotdel University after a very famous member of the Bolsheviks and the secretary or president, I think, of the first Soviets. There was a university there where they would be taught not only skills to help them in a job, but also political lectures. There were various communist universities as well, and then there were technical colleges. So what it was to do was to educate women along with integrating them into workplaces and other establishments. And this was a very popular form of organization, partly because it wasn't a static organization. There was movement between the different, between the factory and the educational establishments. And also they were able to take initiatives, whether on a district level in a particular part of the city to set up different support services, or within the factory. And it was meant to be, I think what you could say, it was meant to be a non-permanent organization. It was meant to respond to existing conditions rather than become a permanent fixture. And while the Zhenotdel was an organization that fought for women's rights within the party, it also fought for socialism. And they also involved and wanted to involve men. in it also from the very beginning. So it was meant to be like a collective effort for both men and women in the party, but the delegate meetings were the most important form of organization that they began to use to educate and organize women in the Soviet Republic. So I'm just moving on. Sorry, you're muted, but I'm just moving on then. Okay, so there I've got the delegate meeting. So during the first period, during the Civil War, what the delegate meetings did a lot of the time was organize support for the war effort. So women were involved in all aspects of that in the traditional way, like as nurses and as you know, women were in the factories, of course, but also in the traditional ways, you know, in terms of producing uniforms and other support for the men at war, mainly men at war. Some women did also take part in the war effort as soldiers, but very few. Mostly they were involved in the medical and support services, but there was a big move towards that to, you know, women, like the argument was that women need to be part of our society. Women need to be pulled into this movement because it needs to be universal struggle, this war. And that was a very difficult time in lots of ways because people were very poor and there was famine and there were lots of problems because of the double burden that women would have suffered with the men away was accentuated. But at the same time, it was a very positive time because they were resolving their own problems with these different social services they were setting up, and they felt like everything was going forward. So that was during the period of war communism, which ended in 1921, 1920, 1921. And by this time, a woman who's very well known called Alexandra Kollontai was head of the Zhenotdel. So she took over when Armand died. And she also had a huge, you know, influence on the organization, but she was very much, although she had ideas that were radical and sometimes she was seen as somebody who was too left-wing and too utopian, in many respects, I think she has to be recognized as part of a collective group of Bolshevik women who agreed on the main questions, i.e. that the women's emancipation was going to come through the struggle for socialism and that they needed to be part and parcel of that struggle. So she was involved from 1920. But just before going on to look at her legacy and about the new economic policy that was introduced in 1920, I'd just like to say a few words about abortion. So Russia, like other parts of the world, had a complete prohibition on abortion up to 1920. Like other countries in the world, it had an enormous rate of backstreet abortions, of women's death, and because of that, and you know, the practices of illegal abortionists. And there was a very strong awareness of this as a problem among the medical profession. So even before the revolution, they had begun to discuss whether abortion should be made available. But then with the revolution, the situation took a shift towards, you know, making that actually a possibility. And there was a discussion set up between the new Commission for Health and the Zhenotdel in 1920. So what happened was that there were reports to Nadia Krupskaya, who I mentioned before, who was obviously also an important person, and a number of others. There were meetings held between them, and basically a plan was put in place to make abortion a possibility. And in late 1920, abortion law was passed. So the abortion law was to provide abortions in hospitals in Russia for women who needed an abortion, and there was no requirement to show that you had special reasons for doing so. It was simply something that they believed that they didn't really want, but they believed that was necessary. I think that at that time, there was like a concern about the question of population, because there were very many right-wing Malthusians who believed that the working class was having too many children, and the Zhenotdel was, like many others, wary of this, but at the same time they recognized that something had to be done. So the abortion law was put in place in 1920, and it turned out to be extremely popular. Women did seek to limit their number of children they had, and they did so in safety. The procedure was a little bit uncomfortable or quite painful, I think, sometimes, because they didn't have a lot of painkiller medication, but the conditions were safe and there were no problems. With the actual hospital abortions, the backstreet abortions did continue, and then they started to put limitations. After 1924, things shifted more, I think, with the advent of the new economic policy. Things did definitely shift backwards in terms of attitudes towards women, and the expectation that they would have children if they were pregnant. You know, the idea that they could control their own fertility was a less popular one, and women were under more pressure. So there were limitations put on women having abortions after 1922, 23, but you know, it didn't resolve the problem, and it continued to be an important amenity for women up to 1934, when Stalin banned it. So it was the first country in the world to make abortion available as a health measure for women, and to make it available for free within the state provision. And that's, you know, I think that was a huge step forward, and I don't think it would have happened without the Zhenotdel being there to advocate for the mass of women in Russia who needed that facility. So anyway, so by 1921, there were lots of women in the workplace in Russia and the rest of the Soviet Union. They had come in during the war, and they had stayed during the Civil War. And I've already described how, despite the difficulties, there was a sense of going forward. But with the introduction of the new economic policy in 1921, things really did take a turn for the worse. Now, at this stage, Alexandra Kollontai was involved with a platform called the Workers' Opposition, which opposed the new economic policy. And without going into the details of that, it was defeated, and she and others associated with it came under enormous pressure to conform to the new turn, and she didn't. So she was removed from her position as head of the Zhenotdel in 1922, and she was sent abroad to work in the diplomatic service. She only returned a couple of times after that. So now at this stage, they really had lost a lot in terms of their leading members. An SR man has died, Kollontai was sent away, and there were other important figures who were also killed during the Civil War, either because of the war or because of disease. But they remained a very strong organization, and they had a new leadership under Sofia Smidovic, and they began to oppose the new economic policy in their own way. And when I say oppose it, to oppose the results of it. So what happened? So rather than women being working and having childcare and whatever facilities available to them, they were now expected to leave the workplace. And there were many, many, tens and hundreds of thousands of women who lost their jobs, who were made redundant in that period, partly because of the return of men from the Civil War, and partly because of the introduction of market forces. And that caused a lot of problems for these women, and a lot of problems for society as a whole, of course. And whereas up to then, the laws had said that women and men, under the new divorce laws, women and men had their own individual property, you know, that the man wasn't responsible for the woman or vice versa. And children, men would pay maintenance for children, but not for their wives. But now this became a problem for women because they had no income, and they had children to look after. And basically there had been many thousands of unregistered marriages, so basically the law had changed in 1917 and divorce was available on request. But many people like then didn't even bother getting married. There were many, many unregistered marriages. It was a big phenomenon. So women found themselves then, after they lost their jobs, they found themselves in a situation where there were no legal obligations to maintain them, and they began to demand, sections of them began to demand that they be maintained by the men, and the law change, which Kollontai protested against, because it created a dependency on men and on individual relationships, which is something that they were trying to move away from. So I suppose, like, I should say that this is all in context. You know, this is a kind of a microcosm of the struggle. You can say, you know, you can't say that this was the future going forward. This was a society in difficulty after the fact that the German Revolution didn't take place, and it was very isolated. So you can describe what the Zhenotdel was trying to do as like an experiment in limited circumstances that they tried to take as far as it could, and then look at the problems they faced, not from the point of view of, weren't the Bolsheviks, you know, evil or, you know, really patriarchal, which many of them were, but look at it from the point of view of what the market means for women, how the market cannot bring about equality, how you have to have a society that's based on need in order to allow real equality to be explored, or emancipation to be explored, especially in a situation where for many women, they needed the education. You know, they, like many of the things that they were, I mean, in the factories in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, well, okay, you know, these were women who were had been working for many years. But outside of that, in smaller towns and villages where women started to work and were kind of empowered to work, they needed education and they needed skills. And so they weren't going to be big earners. And therefore, because of that, they were often seen as, you know, a waste of money. And so if this was a society or a state at the time that was able to continue to fund these enterprises, there wouldn't have been a difficulty. But with the new economic policy, a lot of the investment dried up, so that caused problems. But what they did do instead was they set up cooperatives. So these would be like smaller enterprises where they, you know, where they made, I suppose, things that would normally have been made in handicrafts industry and other kinds of smaller level enterprises, in order to keep women in work and provide them with some money and some independence. So that's the history of that period.
Thanks very much. It has raised a lot of questions for me, so I don't mind. I hope you don't mind.
No, of course not, please.
That's a very good summary. I didn't know a lot of it anyway, although I had read some stuff, but I didn't. So one of my questions is first on this question of divorce law, family law, and especially what you say, which is very important, that people chose not to get married because there was no need for it. Given that many of the people in even urban areas were recent workers, i.e. they had roots in the peasantry, background of a peasant background, but also some were rural areas. I assume there was, both within the party, but also outside the party, a lot of opposition to this. And I wondered if you could put it in the context of the time. I mean, we are talking of the beginning of the 20th century. So presumably religious people opposed it. I don't know. I'm just wondering, because if something like this happened in the global south, or even in the advanced capitalist countries, I can see churches up in arms and, you know, religious groups up in arms.
So on divorce and the laws around child maintenance, the debates on that are interesting because the right wing was really represented by the peasant organizations, peasant women organizations. But I really don't think there was any organized opposition to divorce, free divorce on demand. Well, obviously the feminist movement was gone, which, you know, like because they had been defeated because of its own actions during the war. It had supported the provisional government in continuing the war. So it had like completely fallen from grace. And I think that divorce was very popular. Lots of people got divorced. I think that, of course, in the countryside, there were, you know, traditional customs and like a cultural environment that wouldn't have supported divorce. But it seems to me that, like, even, and I'll talk about it next time, even in parts of the Soviet Union, like eastern parts of the Soviet Union, for instance, Uzbekistan, divorce was so popular. Many, many women got divorced. Many of them went and looked, they wanted to get rid of these husbands if they didn't want them, if they weren't giving them what they needed, if they were treating them badly, they wanted to divorce them. And then obviously men did also divorce. So divorce was really, really popular. And there was a period, I would say up to maybe about 24 or 1924, 25, where there was a sense of impermanence. And when I say that these were non-registered marriages, like Kollontai wrote about them with great enthusiasm, saying that women were now free, she didn't have to live with her man anymore, she didn't have any of those issues. But Krupskaya writes about them in a different tone, and she said that, well, what often happened was that they weren't living together. She had children with him, so she was like a single mother, a lone parent, and he lived in another part of the city, and the people were living in quite cramped living conditions. So it wasn't like always wonderful, but that it happened. And I think that people really didn't seem to, I think that although the new economic policy did introduce a notion of, well, the women need to go back home again, and more conservative ideas, in general, there remained this concept of you didn't have to get married. If you didn't have to get married, you wouldn't get married. So there was a big shift. And that's an interesting thing about that period, is that, and it's little known really, is that it had its own sexual revolution in those days, you know. But yeah, with hardships, but certainly I don't know of any, like, I don't know of any real opposition to divorce, but I think what happened was that there was a real movement for women to receive maintenance for themselves from husbands. That did happen. And then the legislation was changed in 1926 to put an obligation on men to maintain their children. But yeah, not before then. So yeah, a good 6 years, 6 or 7 years of a different way of operating.
So that was very good. Thanks. That explains quite a bit. You said something which is very interesting, and that was that the market forces basically forced women to return, and that's inevitable if you look at it from an abstract, even economic point of view. I was at a seminar about Iranian women's protests, and someone said, well, these women's protests will lead to democracy. And you think, well, women's struggles always lead to democracy, and you think, well, democracy for whom, which class, and what does it mean in the current situation? But I wanted you to talk a bit about women. You have written in the past about other ways in which women were helped when they had to get involved in work, right? In terms of communal kitchens, communal work. I wondered if you could expand a bit about that, because in some ways, in an ideal situation, unless some very basic issues about work within the house is not changed, and is not changed because people suddenly become educated or liberated or revolutionary, but changed because there are practical solutions to the problem, I can't see how things will change for women. So I'd be interested for you to expand some of those. I know you've worked on them, but I just want to have some examples of practical examples of things.
So I think that the majority of factories in St. Petersburg and Moscow and other major cities had nurseries attached to them, so that women were able to leave their children at those nurseries when they went to work. And that also, in the very beginning, from 1917 until around New Economic Policy, I would say again, the public canteens were extremely popular. And like even today, you know, in Russia today, and I think actually in other parts of Eastern Europe, you have this phenomenon called Salovaya, which is a canteen. And they're canteens that, you know, like they're little cafes that you can have really good food at a cheap price, and they're a remnant from that period. So it wasn't like fast food or anything like that. It's good food. Many of them are actually run by Georgians in Moscow and St. Petersburg, so you've got really good food. So those existed. So I think that they continued, but I'm not sure to what extent they continued outside of the main cities. But the absolute, the sort of the, when I say absolute, but the commitment, the absolute commitment to childcare most definitely was put into practice. And that was in the factories. So women's children were left at the workplace nursery, and they went to work, and obviously then they went to school and they went back to the nursery. And then again, I mean, just to say that this phenomenon continued right through, even after the Zhenotdel was closed down by Stalin and the situation changed very much. Perhaps it was of use to Stalin because it meant that women could go to work in large numbers, but the position of nursery and childcare within the factory, that remained. I don't know what it's like now, but it was an important phenomenon within Soviet society right the way through. What wasn't done, though, was that there wasn't a provision for childcare outside of working hours. So at the end of the day, women would have to go home and do the cooking. And obviously that suggests that the public nutrition fell by the wayside to a certain extent. And then they weren't really able to become involved in politics. So I think that overall, the question of childcare and work was resolved to a greater or lesser extent in smaller areas, a lesser extent, to a greater extent within the cities. So that was a really, really important aspect of their work, because, you know, you compare that to the West, that like doesn't, even it still doesn't exist. You know, you have to travel such and such a place to leave your children, and then you have to travel to work. But then if you're in the workplace and your child is sick during the day, you can go and be with them, you know, they're close to you. So it's obviously was a big step forward. And, you know, again, I mean, just referring to a later part of the Soviet experience, I remember reading a book about women in Russia in the 1980s, which said that women actually really enjoyed their work because they had their friends there and the children were looked after there, and they saw that as a place of collectivity and as a place of kind of empowerment, whereas then home life wasn't, because of the friction between men and women, which I think became a real issue, especially at the later stages of the Soviet Union, where women had a double burden. There was too much put on them, and men, and there's been this, perhaps I'm drifting a bit from the subject, but there's been this phenomenon of men and drunkenness in the Soviet Union, whereas like men seem to suffer a lot from that and from other social ills. So there were big tensions between men and women. But yeah, so they're two important examples which continued to be important, were institutionalized really by the Zhenotdel in those early days.
That is very good. One last time, I realize we are taking a lot of your time, but one last question. So when people like Kollontai or Anissa Arman started these debates and were talking to the working class, to party members, were they referring to historical text? Was Engels' work produced as an example of, the whole concept of private property, family, the state, and so on? Were the connections made ideologically, or were they talking, I mean, to ordinary people, to the working class? Were they talking in terms of generalities, practical issues, practical matters, or in their writings? I know this is a difficult question. The reason I'm asking it is that it is a problem how to explain this, right? In a traditional society, and in some ways, the Russia of that time was a traditional society in many ways. So how do you go about it? Because even in the 21st century, really, if you look at Engels' book, it's really advanced, right? It's a fantastic book, but it's very advanced for many so-called liberated men and women to grasp it or to understand it. And my own excuse for sections of the Iranian left is that they don't understand or grasp or believe in it, and that's why they can't talk about it, and that's why they can't, if you like, do any practical political work. But I wondered how people like Kollontai approached ideas which must have been the basis of their political work. Sorry, it's a difficult question, I know.
Well, so what they did was they generally, when they were like speaking or writing in a popular fashion, they weren't going back into the details of Engels' work or indeed Bebel's work. August Bebel was actually a more popular text, and also because he was known for being a fighter for women's rights within the German parliament, and he remained famous after his death. So they could point to him in terms of what he did in action. And also they would say that women's position is not something that's been eternal back into society and does not need to be eternal going forward. They were really arguing against ideas that women's position within the family is a natural one, that women are naturally they're naturally better in the home, that they are not naturally suited to public life and politics. And so they were arguing against this. And so that was one thing they said, that it's not an inevitability that the family changes, and that the family in that period was in crisis, and the way to resolve the crisis within the family is to socialize the function of the family. So they would say to women, the Soviet state represents your liberator. This is the way in which you will fulfill your needs. They knew that they could say to women that they were unhappy with their position within the home, that they felt imprisoned within the home, that they felt disempowered by men, that they wanted to live a life which wasn't so hidebound. And they knew they could say that to women with confidence, because the women that felt like that would come to their meetings and would come to their congresses. But so then they would say, and this is the way that we will overcome it. But they did have fears to address, because sometimes the women were afraid because they'd been told that the Bolsheviks were going to steal their children. And so therefore ideas of collective childcare had to be explained. So they'd say, you know, you only do this if you want. Nobody's going to run away with your children. We just want to resolve your issues so that you can do things that you want to do. You don't have to do them. And so in that sense, I suppose the ideas that they put to them was, this is an exciting project. We're building socialism. Socialism means that we are going to try to address the problems of hunger, and, you know, the profit system will be no more. And it's your opportunity to get involved in this. And previous risings have shown that this is entirely possible. In the past, women were a lot more free than they are today. And so it's like, it is really about the struggle for a new society based on need and away from capitalism. So yeah, that's how they would have explained it.
Thanks very much. I should have mentioned Babel, you're right. But anyways, that was very good. Thanks very much for this. In the third part, Anne is going to talk about something that is of great interest, not only to women in Iran and Afghanistan, but I think the Middle East in particular, and that is the Muslim countries, the women of the East, as you say, and the Southern Republic. And hujum, which for Iranian speakers has a very strong word because it means aggression and fighting and so on. So looking forward to that, but in the meantime, thank you very much, Anne. That was a really thought-provoking and lots of information for all of us. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.